Hi, everyone. The information sheet I have says moderator NA, so unless there's a Mr. or Miss NA here, I'm just going to moderate myself. So I'm Paul Krugman. Just to let everybody know, I'm actually going to cut this off at 3:15 because I actually have a plane I really need to catch. So it's 90 minutes is kind of a long time anyway. So I'll try and hold it to that. And basically, what I want to do is talk for a little while, and then probably just do questions because that's always more interesting. Let me tell you what am I doing here? So I had, I think it's two things. One, last fall, for some reason, there was a fair bit of publicity about me, and one of the things it's not the first time I've mentioned it, but one of the things that came out in the reports was that I said that, what originally got me into economics was that I read the Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy, and I wanted to be a psychohistorian, and economics was as close as I could get. The other thing is that I do have a blog at the Times, and a couple of points I mentioned some of the work of Charlie Strauss, whose stuff I really love, and as a result, there's another website called Crooked Timber, which is a very quirky place, and they have book symposia where people weigh in on the writings of particular authors. And they had a Charlie Strauss symposium, so I weighed in with a piece about the family trade novels, which, as I explained, are really not science fiction. They're actually about development economics. If you know the novels, that actually kind of makes sense, right? People move between worlds, and the heroine is 21st century American who actually keeps on slipping into this medieval society in a parallel universe. And you would think that being able to bring all this 21st century technology right over there would transform everything, but it turns out it's not that easy. And as I pointed out in the piece on Charlie Strauss, we actually do that experiment all the time. We have a third world and we have a first world, and the technology is out there, but actually transforming societies is really, really hard. And in some cases we succeed, but we don't know why. Which is, in a way, gets me to the point that I'm getting at. When I read Asimov's Foundation trilogy, actually, it's mostly the first book and a half, if you've actually read it, because it actually changes quite a lot thereafter. The first book and a half is about, galactic civilization is falling, although nobody knows that. But there are these social scientists who have a genuine theory of how society evolves and predictive laws, and they realize that we're headed for thousands and thousands of years of barbarism, but that if they intervene in just the right place, just the right time, they can change things so that the period of barbarism is much shorter. And the structure of the first book and a half, which I believe were actually published episodically, they were actually published as sort of short stories telling the story, is there is a crisis. Things are coming to a head. There's a crisis. There are people struggling. There is desperate action. There's heroic behavior or cowardly behavior, and then at the end, a recording of Harry Seldon, the great psychohistorian, appears and explains to them that, of course, it all worked out for the best because it had to. That actually none of the individual stuff mattered. It was all the laws of society were pointing to where things were going to come out. So anyway, this is what I was certainly very inspired by that. Obviously, it's fiction. Obviously, there are things that it's never going to look like that. Among other things, to get seriously wonkish on you, if it appears, I reread the stuff on my Kindle on the flight up. It appears that that the psychohistorians have got closed-form analytic solutions to this stuff. And even in physical sciences, that doesn't happen with complex things. Weather is certainly a whole lot easier than social evolution is ever going to be. And yet, weather forecasting, aside from me, you cannot actually do precise forecasts 1,000 years into the future. It involves tremendous amounts of just plain numeric simulation. You don't actually sit there and say, the theorems say that this is what's going to happen. But it did have this idea that you can look for some underlying story that's not just about who did what when, but that history is about the forces working out, and that if you could try to understand those forces, it might do a great deal of good, and anyway, it would be really, really interesting. That's something that sank in with me quite early. The other thing that comes out of, if you read science fiction, if you read other genres of fiction, you can learn a lot about the way people are. You learn a lot about the way society is. You can get a great picture of what it's like. You don't get out of those sorts of fiction very much thinking about, well, what are the ways in which this can change? You don't get why are things the way they are? And one way you get to thinking about why the things are the way they are is to think about what might make them different. What would happen if? And then you can do various versions of what might happen if. And of course, not all science fiction is like that. There are all kinds of variants. But there are a lot of science fiction where people imagine some kind of new technology, some kind of event, and then you try and think about how does that change everything. What stays the same, what's different. We're just all trying to get, what is society about? So I went off to college, inspired by all this, but actually thinking that what I really wanted to do was history. And in fact, I did in college take more history classes than economics classes. It's great stuff. Some of those history classes were really fascinating. Some were also really boring, but that's what happens in college. And but what you don't get very much in the way we do history, in the way history is taught, is why. You get what happens. In fact, it's almost a principle among historians, for good reasons. Historians work very hard to get away from trying to impose interpretations on history based upon simplistic, preconceived ideas. So the whole what actually happened is a big thing in history, and has to be, but it wasn't what I was looking for. Whereas economics is a lot of, you are of course looking for general principles. You're looking for models. You're looking for stories that are not just an overlay of lots of real world detail, but trying to get an underlying story. And there's a method. Now, a word about economics. What does it mean to do economics? And we have a method which has got limitations and traps in it, but there's a method. But economics, I like to say, is really about two things. I think of it two stories. One is the story of the old economist and the younger economist walking down the street, and they see a $100 bill lying on the pavement, and the younger economist says, "Look, there's a $100 bill," and the older one says, "Nonsense! It was there. Somebody would have picked it up already." And that's what that's getting at is sometimes you do find $100 bills lying on the street, but not often. Generally, people do respond to opportunity. They respond to incentive. So that's one piece of economics. The other is the Yogi Berra line in various versions, but say it's about Coney Island. So nobody goes to Coney Island anymore. It's too crowded. That doesn't make sense. But that's getting at, in a way, the idea that things often tend to some kind of equilibrium where what people expect is in line with what they actually encounter, and sort of things settle down. And those two things, now what they become in a lot of economics is they become much more hard-edged than that. It becomes maximization. People have some utility function which mathematically describes what they want, and they do act in a totally rational way to get what they want, and equilibrium, meaning that supply equals demand in all markets and everything fits together. Some economists, way too many, not maybe, definitely way too many economists think that that's true. That's what actually happens. What it actually is these are simplifying. They're gadgets. Can openers is the phrase which comes out of another joke probably the whole one about the economists and the physicist, the chemist, the economist stranded on a beach, and they have these cans of food but can't open them, and the economist finally says, "Assume you have a can opener." So there's there are things you use to try and cut through problems, and the trap, or one of the traps, is believing that they're literally true, and that gets you into all kinds of trouble if you start to believe that the world must obey these simplified models that you're using to think about it. But used appropriately, they can, you can get a lot out of it, up to a point. So, I encountered this quite early, but it was kind of where I saw that economics would really, really help in talking about history, trying to find patterns. So, let me give you a little bit of economics and then a historical story that one of my old teachers drew out of it. So probably a lot of people know about the Ricardian theory of land rent, which is, if you haven't, it's a pretty simple idea in retrospect, and it can be elaborate. But basically, back in 1819, David Ricardo wrote up his explanation of what determines the rent that farmers pay. At that point, England was mostly tenant farmers, big landowners, tenant farmers working the land. What determines the rent that tenant farmers pay? And his notion was we have a population, and people farm the land, and they fill up, but obviously they fill up the best land first, and then the next best land, and finally, at the margin, the last farmers are working the least, line up the land in order, take the best first, then on down. If you ask what rent are the farmers on the worst land going to be paying? And the answer is none, because if landlords tried to charge them any rent on that, someone who owns some land that's just a little bit worse would say, well, why don't you come farm my land, and I'll pay half as much as that guy is charging you in rent. And because the land is almost as good, they get it. So what Ricardo argued is that the income of farmers is determined by the worst land that's in cultivation. Income of farmers is what you can grow on the worst land that's actually in cultivation. And any land that's better than that, the landlords take the difference between what the farmer produces and what the farmers on the worst land are producing. So it's what's nice about that story, for starters, is you might look at, say, England in 1819 and think that the question of what the farmers got versus what the landowners got was a complicated thing. You have to talk about history and class relations and all of that. And Ricardo's saying, actually, no, it's this little mathematical thing, which is really neat. But then you say, well, history is full of examples where there weren't free bargains between peasants and lords. So how do we think about that? And it turns out that actually the theory, and this is where I get to where I really liked it, this simple theory about what determines land rent actually sheds some light on the broader thing. So there's a great paper, 1970, I think, by my old MIT teacher, S.A. Delmar, called Economic Causes of Slavery and Serfdom, in which he said, it made a simple, his argument was this: suppose you have a densely populated Malthusian society, where you're really up against the point where the marginal farmer is basically growing only enough to keep him alive in a normal year. Which, by the way, is the way things have been through most of human history. In that case, you could turn the peasants into serfs. You could say, you belong to somebody, and we're going to extract your surplus. I don't know what that was. But there's really no point, because the ordinary economics are forcing the peasants down to subsistence levels of consumption anyway, and you can't push them any lower, so no point. When serfdom only becomes profitable, only becomes worth it, if you actually are not at the Malthusian age, if you've got a fair bit of slack. We know that in medieval Europe, high Middle Ages, sort of 11th, 12th century, serfdom sort of faded out as an institution. Why that happened? Was it because Europe became a nicer place? No, not really. It's because population grew, and you were basically at the edge of subsistence. And so there was really not much point in making your peasants into serfs. And Domar went on and said, well, what happens if opportunities open up? What happens if off in the east, the coming of muskets means that all of a sudden the farmers have a military advantage instead of their historical disadvantage against the nomads, and they start being able to move out into the steppe and settle it, and a whole lot of land opens up, and there's actually a scarcity of labor instead of a surplus. Well, then you, if they can, the landlords will go along and start turning their peasants into serfs, so that they don't run away to all the fresh new land that's been opened up. And that's how you get serfdom in Russia, which turns out is not an ancient institution. It's not a medieval institution. It's something that started showing up in the 16th century. Before that, there was not a lot of difference between Russia and Western Europe in the way it dealt with its peasants. What if you are opening up all these lands in the New World that where it's been sparsely populated, and you have a lot of land, and actually an individual person working on a farm can produce quite a lot of stuff? Well, it starts to make sense to start bringing a bunch of slaves from Africa. And so he has this theory, which says actually that serfdom in Russia and the peculiar restitution in the United States have a basic and economic origin. Now, what it doesn't tell you is why, when Western Europe became a labor shortage economy after the Black Death, why didn't the nobility manage to reinsert the peasants? That's an interesting question. It doesn't tell you why, when the Industrial Revolution came along and everybody started living well above subsistence, why aren't we all serfs? Actually, maybe we are, but anyway, but it certainly gives you a tremendous amount of insight into a whole new story. There's a lot more going on than just Prince Igor did that and Prince Sergei did that. Instead, you've got a story about why it was actually, in this case, I remember there was that old British series with the guy in bell-bottom pants, Connections. There we are. But Connections. Why does gunpowder lead to the Russian peasants becoming serfs? And the answer is, well, gunpowder means that you can drive back the nomads, and you can take all that land, and all of a sudden you have labor is actually worth something, and in that case you've got to enslave it. So this is great. This is the kind of thing that I really love about economics. Also, I think that the thing that comes, the last positive thing we're going to say is that a lot of the things that happen to us are not, in most but not all science fiction, you tend to think of what drives events as being new technology, new stuff, or depending on particularly on the subgenre, or the aliens arrive, or something like that. But so much of what happens to us is actually the mysterious internal logic of human societies. It's look, right now, in the conversation with Charlie Strauss yesterday, I talked about this a little bit, but we've got this awesome.
Whoa! Hey, doggy.
Did I say something wrong?
No, everything's fine.
He can still hear you.
Keep talking.
Well,
somebody needs on the light switch.
Probably somebody standing at the back there is needing on a switch, would be my guess.
Push the light switch again.
Nobody's going up.
Boy. Where was I? Technology, right. But no, he said it wasn't technology. There was no technological change. That was the mysterious actions of human society. So we have this incredible crisis in the world economy right now, and it's, the technology isn't significantly different now from the way it was a year ago. Actually, I think I mentioned it, but there's a wonderful essay by John Maynard Keynes that was written at the end of 1930, called The Great Slump of 1930, which reads very well as a description of what's happening now. And he says, we have blundered in the operation of a complex and delicate machine, the workings of which we do not understand. And that's basically, the world economy is a machine that we don't understand, we certainly don't understand well enough, and somehow somebody hit the wrong switch, and or actually a better analogy would be that we sort of had an operating system crash. And that's an amazing thing. It's, from a certain point of view, I have to say, it's a little bit bloody-minded, but although I'm worried and I have relatives out of work and all of that, I'm also kind of fascinated. Wow, this is like being a volcanologist when Yellowstone finally decides to explode. So this is really interesting stuff. I think where I'll end this is saying that the great fun of what I do is trying to make sense of this. We don't do psychohistory. Right? The idea that you can do precise predictions, or even that you have anything resembling a complete theory. And I think that's as I said, there are traps, and the biggest trap into which economists fall is of believing that the beautiful models are a complete picture of the reality out there. But being able to make sense of it, being able to at least carve out part of the problem and say, I understand how that works. And especially because it's about people. It's about what happens to human beings is what makes it so interesting. But you've got to keep speculating. And this is why I still read science fiction. I don't like all of it. There'd be something wrong with me if I did. But it's because it's that constant speculation. Think about, never take it for granted that the way things are at this moment is the way they always have to be. Things can change, and what you need to do is understand the ways in which they can change. And that seems like a good thing to keep in mind always, and particularly in the professional work I do. So that's my excuse for actually picking out and reading a bunch of sci-fi novels on the plane when I should be finishing the paper. But anyway, always good stuff to do. With that, let me just say, I can probably just call on people. It's not that big a room. We should be able to hear you. So let me just try that. Start right there.
In the physical sciences, we're able to test theories both by how well they fit the data that we already have and in terms of their predictive power. And I think you've just said that economics, we absolutely cannot do that with our theories and models. So how do we use them effectively, and especially in terms of making judgments on them with future action?
Okay, yeah. So people didn't hear that question. Was in physical sciences you can do testing, you can do experiments as well as look at the past data. And what do you do in economics if you can't do that? A couple of things. One, sometimes you can. There is actually a growing subfield called experimental economics, which tries to do small-scale versions. Tries to get people into market-like situations or other things and see how they behave. And on the other hand, for the physical sciences, you can't actually do tests. So again, if you think about to take something that's as controversial as economics, climatology. We may be able to test the underlying physical processes on a small scale, but the way they fit together is hard, and one relies on simulation models, and you can't actually. Well, you could argue that we actually are performing a giant experiment on the climate, but when we find the results, it'll be too late to act on it. But beyond that, though I will say that one thing that I like to do is, that economists do in general, like the work good economists do, is you do look for small-scale examples of what it is you're trying to model, which is not the same thing, unfortunately, as really testing your theories with experiments, but you look for small-scale examples. So for years, I've used the story of the Capitol Hill Babysitting Co-op to explain macroeconomics. And, oh hell, I'm going to tell you the story because it's such a great story, and I think it gives you an idea of how you do this. So there's a paper. Actually, it was funny because no one seemed to notice the paper, even though it was in print, and I noticed it. A 1977 paper called Monetary Theory and the Great Capitol Hill Babysitting Co-op Crisis. And it's a true story, according to the authors, and actually people have contacted me and told me that they've encountered similar stories. This was the Capitol Hill Babysitting Co-op was about 150 couples, young couples, all with at least one spouse working on Capitol Hill. And they made arrangements where they would babysit each other's children. And it was, they were all a little short of money. But any kind of arrangement like that requires that people, some mechanism to make sure that everyone does their fair share. So what they did was a script system. Coupons, each representing half an hour of babysitting time. And when you joined the co-op, you were given 20 coupons, and when you departed the co-op, you were supposed to return 20 coupons. And if somebody looked after your children, you were supposed to give them the appropriate number of coupons. And so the thing was self-enforcing. It turned out that on average, the members of the co-op, people wanted to hold a reserve, right? You might want to go out several nights in a row. So on average, the number of coupons that people wanted to hold was more than 20. They wanted, on average, to hold a reserve of more than 10 hours of babysitting time in their credit accounts. And this had created a problem because people were reluctant to go out and use their coupons. And they were eager to babysit, which meant that it was actually hard to get opportunities to babysit, which made people even more reluctant to use their coupons. All right, you got the point, right? The co-op fell into a recession. Since the thing was being on Capitol Hill was run by lawyers, their initial response was, was to have rules. Everybody must go out at least twice a month. And eventually the economists convinced them that it was monetary, and they put out more coupons. But this is this is the kind of thing that it's okay. This is as I said, this is the true story. And since I wrote that up, which is about 10 plus years ago in Slate, I have gotten a number of people saying that I was a member of a co-op and we had the same problem. So it appears to be a true story. So this is the kind of thing. Now, does that prove that that's a basically Keynesian view of what a recession is about? Does that prove that the Keynesian view is actually right? Not exactly. It does show that something that looks like a Keynesian model of a recession can actually happen. It's pretty clear what was going on in that case, but it doesn't prove. So we have a lot of limits, but I would say that it's not clear that it's that much worse for economics than it is for the physical sciences, the complex stuff. It's somewhat harder because we don't actually. We have a lot of problem. We know that people aren't perfectly rational. But there are lots and lots of ways to be imperfectly rational, and so it's hard to pin down exactly what people really will do. But the lack of experiments, I think, is not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is just that it's so damn hard to understand something as complex as society, of which economics is a part. Okay, yeah.
Let me ask the big current events question. I'm really baffled by the apparent stock market rise. Sorry, this will be a little bit U.S.-centric. Because back in March, sort of the nightmare scenario was GM and Chrysler to go bankrupt. Check. The toxic assets are still, as far as I can tell, on the bank's books. The housing market is still down below water. All the growth in the last 7 years seem to have been from lending and leverage. So why do people seem to think we're coming out of it with their green shoes? I'm missing this.
Okay, first line, there's an old... there's an old line from Paul Samuelson from decades ago where somebody asked him what the predicted value of looking at stock prices was, and he said, well, the stock market had forecast 9 of the last 5 recessions. The modern version, which is Neuro Economics, you may know Neuro at NYU, and was closest to anybody getting this thing right, and is now known as Dr. Doom. But Neuro has said that this time the stock market has forecast 6 of the last 0 recoveries. So you don't want to pay too. But there is news. In March, in April, a lot of us were looking at the numbers so far and saying that basically the first year of this crisis was as bad as the first year of the Great Depression. It really did look like we might be headed really into the abyss. That looks a lot less likely now. Things have leveled off. Things are getting worse more slowly. It doesn't, but that's literally true, right? This morning we lost whatever it was, 247,000 jobs. Which is a lot better than losing 700,000 jobs, which is what was happening every month a few months ago. There is some real news that the plunge into the abyss seems to have been canceled. It's still lousy. The internet stocks, the Dow. I don't know where, but the Dow was almost at 14,000 before the crisis hit. So we're nowhere near seeing financial markets sounding the all clear. I think that the markets are still not putting sufficient weight. I think that the end of the world scenario is now fairly low probability. But I don't think the markets are fully factoring in the lost decade scenario, which is that unemployment stays at 9-point-something% for years and years and years, which is something that really, really worries me. But the main thing is if you try and one of the economists who's really come out well in all this stuff is Bob Shiller at Yale, who's actually the author of Irrational Exuberance. He was really responsible for all that. And he did a classic way back, 87, we had the stock market crash. The market fell 23% in a day. And there were all kinds of ex post explanations of why that happened. But Shiller, who had been doing a project where he'd been interviewing a lot of Wall Street traders, had people's fax numbers. It's 1987, remember, so no email addresses, so fax numbers. And he, in the midst of it, as the thing was crashing, he managed to get hold of lots of people, asked, why are you selling? And none of the explanations that were offered after the fact were mentioned. Not only were they, not the majority, none of them were mentioned by people when he asked. What everybody said was the reason I'm selling is because prices are falling. Which is a way of saying there's a lot of just herd behavior in the market. And you really don't want to make too much of what happens whenever it happens. Yeah.
You've obviously fond of the work of Charles Stross. Can you name some other science fiction writers who you think deal well with economics themes, or that we could read and perhaps gain some understanding of economics from?
Oh boy, now I'm afraid because I'm probably going to blank out on people I really should be mentioning. I'm going to probably pass because it's not, my mind is not functioning here. By the way, it's one thing I will say is there was an economic theory that was widespread in the late 40s, which was the doctrine of secular stagnation, basically saying that depression-like conditions were going to be sort of the norm with occasional good times, but basically persistent shortfall of demand. It's a little bit of that in discussion now, but anyway, it turned out to be wrong, at least for the next 60 years or so. But it was very widespread, and there's a really early, really lousy Robert Heinlein novel, whose title I can't remember, but the whole plot is built around the notion that we have this problem of secular stagnation and the constant need to find ways to prop up demand.
Beyond this horizon.
There we are. It was a really bad novel, actually. But yeah.
Preface this by saying that I work in high-speed trading technology.
Yeah.
But I'm also a big supporter of the things like Public Library of Science, and the gentleman here mentioned physics. And things like the Public Library and the ability of physicists now to get their work out and get critiqued and get that feedback cycle going has been very important to the physicists that I talk to. And I'm wondering, from your science perspective, has there been a significantly large impact in terms of communication technology or any other technology that's really changed the way you guys do your work?
Yeah, actually. And it's actually come in two phases. First was the widespread internet availability of working papers. I mean, for a long time there's been working papers which came pre-publication, were shipped out, but now anybody in the academic world can have instant access to the working paper of anyone anywhere else, which has done a funny thing, because in economics, for reasons I don't understand, the journals have always been quite slow. The publication process is long. It often, if a paper gets referees who don't understand it, then it goes back and forth, and can often take a couple of years for a paper to be published, which has meant that the journals now are tombstones. They're only you have to have journal publications. Tombstones meaning as in the announcement of a financial deal in the newspaper, so it's in the public record. The most instantly successful paper I ever wrote, I don't think it was actually all that great an insight, but it had people all excited because, hey, we can use stochastic calculus on exchange rates. But it took about 2 years to appear in print, and by the time it actually appeared in print, I had to include a section referring to the derivative literature, which at that point was more than 150 papers. and by the way, the literature on this stuff was decadent by that point. So the whole literature had emerged, flourished, grown decadent, and really was not worth reading anymore by the time the original paper was actually published. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that right now, the econo-blogosphere has been tremendously effective. I mean, given the normal, even the process of publication in magazines, it would be way too slow to keep up with events. And what we have instead is that there are a couple of dozen economics, finance blogs that are constantly interacting. So we'll have a running argument over the interpretation of some policy issue that will unfold over the course of a couple of days between a group of extremely smart people. And I think that is really unique, and it has the special virtue that people, there's a lot of stuff that was just weren't paying attention to, but somebody knows something about it, and so those people come up, and so I can be. I'm reading right now some stuff that was sent to me explaining exactly what happened in the repo market. Now, I have to say that before a year ago, I had never even thought about the repo market, but it turns out that that's where the 21st century version of a bank run happens. No longer mobs in front of banks, but stuff going on in the repo market. And so now I can find and read stuff by people who know about that and are in very nearly real time. So all that makes a difference. All that said, what is amazing is how much the broad shape of this crisis really just does look like 1929-30. It's things haven't changed as much as one might have imagined. Yeah.
Two questions, one more idle. Has there been any derivative works on your paper on Interstellar trade?
Okay. So yeah, I wrote. So people got. Yeah, that was something I wrote.
Repeat the question, please.
Have there been any derivative papers on my paper on interstellar trade? The history of this, by the way, I was an assistant professor, 1978. going through more or less assistant professor hell, which is, you really don't think you're going to get tenure, you can't seem to get anybody to pay attention to you, whatever. And to let off steam, I wrote a paper on the theory of interstellar trade, which is finally getting published. It was not exactly a serious paper. It says in the introduction something along the lines of this paper is a serious analysis of a ridiculous subject, which is, of course, the opposite of what is usual in economics. But not to my knowledge, there have they. But of course, the thing wasn't published, right? The thing was sitting actually literally when we had when somebody said, "Well, I never happened to that old paper." I actually found, I see somebody's holding copies. That thing was typed on a manual typewriter, and I had some Xeroxes. I mean, that's all that there was. So yeah, nothing yet.
That was the year Star Wars came out, you read?
It was the year after Star Wars came out. Now, I do remember, because Star Wars came out during my last year in grad school, and this is my first year as assistant professor at this company.
When I took some economics courses, I was much struck by the very great simplification of human behavior and what drove it. And in fact, sometimes it seemed to be completely opposite of the actual reality that I'm seeing around me. So I was wondering if the recent advances in neuroscience, which I guess would be similar to the psychohistorian stuff, has been informing your study of economics and that of those around you.
Yeah, so the question is, are the neuroscience, is that informing how I think about economics? I don't think so. Though maybe I guess somebody should do a brain scan to find out what I'm saying is true. But no, I mean, it should eventually. The trouble has been it's actually mapping. Even if you have a better understanding of human emotions, human behavior, even human cognition, mapping that into what people actually do in terms of economic decisions is not all that easy. It's so what has been on the rise, and there is something called Neuro Economics, but it's not clear that it's actually paid off yet. Probably there will be stuff that comes out. There's the whole issue of behavioral economics, which does try to use insights from particularly cognitive psychology to make sense of the way people make decisions. And it's been having a gradually growing effect, but it is hard because you tend to have kind of scattershot pieces of insight. So, for example, one thing we know is that people behave, that the framing of a decision affects that decision in ways that should not, in terms of rationality, make sense. The famous one being if you have a 401k plan offered by the company, the question of whether it's whether the default is that you're in or the default is that you're not. Whether you have to whether you have to check a box to join the plan or check a box to take yourself out of the plan, that should make no difference, right? The incentives for if it's a good plan, you should be in it, and if not, shouldn't. But it turns out to make a huge difference. So that actually tells you something quite a lot about how you should design retirement options. But it's not so easy to turn that into a broader insight about how the economy works. So we have a bunch of kind of pieces. Maybe we're all kind of spoiled because the rationality, if you're willing to assume that people are actually rational, that gives you, vast spread of applications. Then you say, well, they're not quite rational, and we've got these 15 observations of ways in which they're not quite rational. How does that change your view? And it's not so sweeping. So it's a bit of a change, but it will, I think, over time get better. But if we're trying to think about the actual behavior of markets. Again, you can go back to John Maynard Keynes in 1936 and read his chapter about behavior of financial markets, which was done just no formal method. He just, as someone who'd done a lot of speculating, he had a pretty good sense of how it all works, and it still reads wonderfully. And so a lot of what we're doing is still on the order of just wise insights rather than careful stuff. But behavioral economics is on the rise. Bit by bit, it's encroaching. The time when it was heresy or regarded as silly because, after all, maximizing behavior had all the answers is no longer there. But the point when it takes over the whole field is probably generations away. Yeah.
I'm actually an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Maryland.
Right.
So I have two questions. Last night, I was really impressed that you were talking about how our modern globalization is due in a large part to container shipping, which is a big thing in anthropology that we talk about. So the first part was, have you studied anthropology formally, or have you picked it up, or integrated it? And then what do you think, have we reached saturation in globalization, the integration economically, socially, or what would be the next globalization step?
Wow, okay.
That's an easy question.
Yeah.
25 words or less, please.
What's that?
25 words or less.
Right.
Use both sides of the paper.
The answer is no and no. So, no, I took Anthro in college, but I have to say, although I remember enjoying it, I don't remember a thing from it. So,
Well, you did very well.
but the container thing is something that it's been tracked. Let's put it this way: you see that there's a real kind of break. There's a surge of globalization that starts around the early 1970s, and there are multiple candidates for what can cause it. That's when Intel introduced the microprocessor, I guess 71. There are some political changes in trade policy, but that's also when container shipping starts coming in. And if you look at the economics of it, the containers make a huge difference. A large part of the cost of shipping is not the cost of getting from here to there, but the cost of getting the stuff onto the ship here and then getting it off the ship at the other end. And containers make a huge difference to that. You get rid of the whole... Get rid of around 800,000 jobs in longshoring, but you also get rid of the costs that are involved, so it becomes much cheaper. And what that's done, what you can actually see it doing in the trade pattern, is that we go from a world where you're only shipping final goods to a world where you can vertically disintegrate the production chain. Boy, how's that for businessy sounding? Where you can, there's an iPod, everybody's favorite example. An iPod is made in China because the final assembly takes place there, but that's only about $1.50 of the value of it. And then all of the other components, some of which are also made in China, but it goes back and forth and back and forth. Actually, the stuff is shipped multiply back and forth, certainly across the South China Sea in the course of making an iPod, and possibly back and forth across the Pacific. And all of that would be impossible if this would all involve taking individual packages on and off of ships. The fact that all stuff can all be put in a dedicated container is what makes it possible. And now, limits of globalization. There are still... There are a couple of things that are still probably in initial stages. One is that a fair bit of the world's population is still not part of this global economy. That there is more penetration and therefore more outsourcing and more breaking up of the chain to take advantage of low-wage labor in various places. And we're just beginning to have a world in which non-physical. In which services can be traded on a large scale. There's still quite a lot less of that than you think. If you actually compare the amount of the number of dollars spent on call centers in Bangalore with the amount spent on factories making plastic doohickeys in South China, the call centers are still a quite small business, but it's growing rapidly. So that's going to come along. So there's probably quite a lot more globalization coming. There's still there is probably a limit because a lot of the economy is stuff that cannot be shipped long distances, and at least won't in the foreseeable future. You can't outsource your haircut. You can't outsource. Even if you buy something at Walmart, the stuff is all made in China, but the actual the delivery system is people working in the United States. So now there are ways you can do it. I mean, people are saying there are now. In some cases, convenience stores where they have, there's a rack with a bunch of stuff. The racks are put together complete with all of the material in them in China and then shipped and then just slotted at the convenience store to do away with the job of one clerk stocking shelves, and instead it's done in China. I don't know how much of that will come, but you can imagine that even some pieces of retail trade can be shipped. But what we know, it probably doesn't work anymore, but the classic sort of limits to globalization thing was Flint, Michigan, when it still had an economy. Where clearly Flint is a one-industry town, nothing but cars. But only about 40% of the workers in Flint were actually in the auto industry. And everyone else is delivering local services to each other. And so that's probably, there's no way, even with modern technology, we're ever going to have more than, well, not, I shouldn't say ever, but until we have, until the clerk in your convenience store is a robot operated by telepresence from somewhere else in the world, we're going to have a situation where 60% of workers are still producing for their neighbors rather than across the world. Yeah. Okay.
Just to follow up on that a little bit for the longer-term future, isn't a limit to globalization that eventually incomes are going to equalize over the world?
Well, yeah, globalization, that's right. Eventually we would expect, the question is, won't limit to globalization be that incomes will equalize? And yeah, in some future where wages are similar, you won't have the kind of trade we have so much of now, where you take the labor-intensive pieces of a production process and have them done in China or in Vietnam, because China's wages are now too high. But two things. One, that's a long ways off, right? I mean, Chinese wages are actually rising fairly rapidly. To the point where they're now about 4% of U.S. wages, so up from 3%. So we're a long ways off. And the thing is, even very, very similar countries do a lot of trade with each other, or certainly similar wage levels. A lot of trade between the United States and Western Europe, even though the wage levels are similar. Lots of trade between the United States and Canada. And you would think that it would all be, forest products for oranges or something, but it's not. It's seeming. This is actually what I got that prize for, was the amazing amount of trade and seemingly similar stuff between seemingly similar countries is telling you that there are other reasons for trade and specialization. So there's still very different if we ever get to that point. But it used to be that a lot of the trade between the northern and southern United States was because of low southern wages, and those wages have largely converged, but there's still an awful lot of people flying into and out of Atlanta. So we're still doing that. Okay, try back there.
Yes. From yesterday, you started asking Charlie what you thought, or what he thought the history would be 30 years from now.
Yeah.
What do you think things will be like 30 years from now?
The question was, what do I think the world will look like 30 years from now? If I'd known, I wouldn't have been asking Charlie Strauss. I have a really hard time making sense of what it's going to be like. My sense is that technology is changing our lives in a lot of ways less. I mean, I really do believe that the the world hasn't, the changes in the way we live our daily lives have actually been, the pace of change in that has actually, generation by generation, been slowing down. That the world, well, let's take a 40-year, see if I can do this one right. Well, 50 years is still, that the world of today is not as different from the world of 1959 as the world of 1959 was from that of 1909. Certainly the way that the change in the way Americans lived is not as great over the past half century as it was over the previous half century. So maybe I think that's going to continue to be true, that if you could somehow find yourself 30 years from now in a shopping mall, you first say, "Oh, look at those great gizmos," and then you say, "But it's still a shopping mall," and it wouldn't be that different. But there's a lot of stuff that seems to be coming to a head. So it's a very different issue. I think we have lots of stuff that's coming to a head over the next 30 years. A little bit hard to something has to give. Certainly, climate change is going to stop being something people can argue about in 30 years, and could be very, very grim in its implications for what's actually going on. We will certainly be well past peak oil by then, so exactly how that plays out, I don't know. So those are actually more like negatives than positives. But who knows? But I just cleaned out my library at home. We finally made a big, because I have among other things, I get 4 copies of every book basically on current events or economics or politics, because the first reviewers' copies, and then and they get sent both of the Times and to my and to Princeton, so I get 4 of everything, and so getting rid of them. And what was really depressing was how many books over the past 20 years I have gotten that says that the big problem of the next decade will be, or the big issue of the next decade will be, and it turned out to be nothing at all like what people were actually worrying about. So I'm really kind of leery of making too many forecasts myself. Sorry.
So one of the things I've admired about you is that you've been kind of a critic of wishful thinking in economics, and I'm wondering if you're aware of the movement in science fiction, the mundane science fiction movement. I think Charlie Strauss might consider himself part of it, where you get away from having warp drive and faster than light travel and sort of unrealistic advances. Are you aware of that?
No, I wasn't aware of that. The mundane movement in science fiction. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting. I've read Charlie Strauss with his very negative thoughts about space colonization, whether it'll ever be possible. And then the question is, are we prepared to sort of give up that storyline? Of course, science fiction doesn't have to be about things that you might think are actually going to happen. It can be speculative ventures. So, as I say, I love Charlie's Family Trade series, and I don't actually think that we're going to start popping into alternate universes, but it's still interesting to play with. But yeah, there is this. It certainly should give you some pause that some of the favorite themes that people thought were going to be part of what the world now would be like a lot of people in space and undersea cities and all of that have not come true. And so you might want to think, I mean, it's of course the problem is that the changes tend to come where you didn't expect them. So people, you read science fiction from 30 years ago, and there's all these people. Actually, oh gosh, this is further back than then. But I remember reading something which had all these people flying around between planets and using slide rules to calculate their next course. So anyway, yeah.
Back to planet Earth for a minute. You wrote in the Conscious Individual that for healthcare, and this is kind of a U.S.-based question, but for healthcare to be the sort of the New Deal, the Social Security was the New Deal, it would have to be universal. It would have to really work to address some issues of inequality. How the current bill that's going through Congress, how would you say that's short? And if it does pass, does it actually undermine the sort of positive aspects that universal health care would have had, according to your argument?
Okay, so if people didn't get that question, I've been called for a lot for universal health care as being the core of what the next phase, a New Deal would be like for America. And what will the bill that, if we get it, which will be basically a bit of a not a bit, will be a Rube Goldberg device, full of kludges. How will that stack up? You don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. I mean, the system I would create from a standing start with no or waving away political reality would be a clean, simple, single-payer system. But it would be like they have in exotic foreign countries like Canada. But that's just not. It's not something we can get this year. We know that for a variety of reasons. So let's say that we got. So there's a House bill, basically. It's essentially the same proposal now passed by 3 House committees, and it's a combination. It uses a combination of regulation and subsidies, pretty much, to try and get near universality. So no discrimination on the basis of medical history. So people can't be rejected for insurance. Basically, you have to give it to everybody. And financial aid for less well-off people so they can afford to buy insurance. And then with some competition from a public plan to discipline the insurance companies. And that is a highly imperfect thing. The question is, at what point does it become sufficiently imperfect that you say to reject it? This may, in the end, be a really tough decision. But I'm really want to see the principle of universal access established, because I think there's pressure to improve it. So, but we have a kind of an experiment, which is Massachusetts has a plan, which is pretty bad in terms of the design. It's got the regulation and the universal access and the subsidies. It has no public plan. It has it's inadequately financed, so the subsidies are really not enough. And nonetheless, it's cut the number of people without insurance a lot, and it's actually creating pressure to fix the thing. So what they're getting, instead of pressure to abandon it because it's imperfect, they're getting pressure to make it work better, which is a reason to go ahead with even a pretty imperfect plan if it gets there. Now, if it's bad enough, you have to say, no, this thing is going to fail from day one, and it'll just discredit the whole project. The House bill does not look like that. If the House proposal actually became law, or was up for a vote, I would support it in a heartbeat, even though it's not at all what I'd like to see eventually, but I'd go for it. What will actually come out of conference committee with the Senate by the time this thing is done, if it ever does get to that point, because things are chancy, is going to be worse. And then the question is going to be how much worse, and that's where we watch to see. But it is, the old line about not wanting to know what goes into sausage and not wanting to go into politics is really this process is horrible, and there are some really bad actors who have seats at the table. But at this point, mostly I'm mostly worried that the whole thing will just fall apart because you can never be cynical enough. I would not have thought that the line Obama's going to kill your mother was actually going to work as that there's euthanasia in the bill was actually going to reach any resonance with the public, but at least apparently it is with some people, so God help us. Yeah.
Looking at engineering and science fiction in the near term, we're looking at the space program and what's going to replace the shuttle. And there's a lot of debate over whether or not commercial interests can take over and we can start building space, solar power satellites and all that. Are there any kind of economic studies that have been done or theories on whether or not going beyond a global economy to economy that includes solar power satellites and colonies on the moon and mining asteroids? Has anybody looked at that?
Probably somebody has, but I haven't seen it. The basic thing with space is that getting a kilogram of stuff into orbit is just so incredibly expensive that so far all we're doing with space is using it as a place to gather and relay information. Which now the amount of stuff we can do with a kilogram worth of information processing capacity, it makes that worthwhile. But it's the rest has really turned out. I'm still, I guess, believing that unless there's some fundamental breakthrough in propulsion, that the space travel that launched 10,000 novels is just not going to happen. Yeah.
So, taking the Keynes quote from before, the machine is complexity we cannot fathom. So what we have is that since things will continuously get more complex, there's profits to be made on the complexity frontier. Is it just that over the past year, as in 1929, that the derivative complexity just got too high, and is it a cycle that's just going to keep repeating in that regard?
I'd go a little more specific than that. What I would say is that finance is a locus for potential catastrophe. It really has been, from the beginning. As soon as people invented banking, we started having bank failures and bank runs, right? So there's always been a trade-off. What happened in the 1930s was that people responded to the crisis by creating a set of safeguards that someone limited the static efficiency of the thing, but also made it much less prone to crashes. And so we created a system of deposit insurance, tightly regulated banks, that was made banking less efficient than it might have been, but also meant that we didn't have catastrophic failures, and led to some weird stuff, right? Not too many people in this room are old enough, but I grew up in the era of a toaster when you open a new bank account, which is a byproduct of limited interest rates and so on. Also created a system, by the way, that was not very competitive. One of the reasons you didn't have crazy behavior by banks for 50 years after the Great Depression was that there was limited competition, so that banks were valuable franchises. Basically, it was a license to make to collect deposits at zero interest and lend them out at a positive sum. So nobody wanted to take risks with the goose that would consistently lay golden eggs. What happened was that as the memory of the Great Depression receded, there was some deregulation of the banks, and even more important, as people created more innovative financial institutions that were for practical purposes banks, although they were not big marble buildings with rows of tellers, the sentiment was not there. The spirit of the times was all against actually extending similar regulations to those institutions. So over the past 25 years, we've gradually built up a financial system where most of the banks weren't banks, right, where the shadow banking system was more important than the conventional banking system, was unregulated, had no safety net, and we created the conditions for a repeat of what happened in the 30s. So there is kind of a cycle. There was a cycle that runs through ideology in the political system as well as the economy proper. not quite clear at the moment. It looks as if we're not actually even going to get a return to effective regulation. At the moment, it can be very cynical about where we're going on the politics of bank reform. But if we don't get effective, we'll have another crash in a little while, and then probably we'll do it. And then we'll have maybe, I guess my sense is that if you can get 50 years before the next big crisis, then that's all we can ever expect, right? It's just what happens. And what is the story about Keynes and the Great Depression and all that is that we did basically manage to recreate the conditions. Not all of them, thankfully, which is why the world hasn't really come to an end. But we managed to recreate many of the conditions for the Great Depression, and in a way at a higher level, because we have a more complex system. We plug the obvious holes, the holes that our grandfathers understood, but we have the new ways that things can fall apart, and that's probably at that kind of meta level. That's probably inevitable. Stuff like that will happen. People will always fail to understand the new vulnerabilities that innovation has opened up. Wow. Oh boy. I'll repeat it. Yeah.
I wondered about a book in Introductory Macroeconomics, because I started articles, but really need some kind of framework, especially regarding business schools, because someone is a member of Euro Economics, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can speak from a Canadian viewpoint, and then you really have to understand that to be able to figure out the article.
Yeah. So the question was a good book for introductory macroeconomics. So Krugman and Wells macroeconomics. It's not mostly a fun read, I'm sorry to say. One thing we do not have. We're kind of lacking in economics in good good popularizers who make the stuff intelligible without doing violence to the underlying ideas, and it's hard, partly because it's really hard to turn the stuff into plain English, and partly because it's so politically fraught that no matter what you say, there will be some group of people screaming at you. So, but for what it's worth, by the way, the text, my own textbook, would try really hard to give a fair treatment to different points of view. So it's not ideologically charged. We actually came out with the first edition of macroeconomics in 2004, and the first edition was really super careful because just given the way American politics were, we didn't want to have. I wanted to avoid giving an obvious reason for people to say, "Oh, it's that horrible Krugman," and reject the book. And actually, then complaints about the first edition were that there wasn't enough of my voice in it. So it's a little bit more open about a viewpoint, but still, it's. And for what it's worth, you're not going to find a whole lot of difference. Find difference in emphasis and coverage, but somebody like Greg Mankiw at Harvard, who was Bush's chief economic advisor, at least on paper, officially, is not hugely different in the way it discusses the issues from the way we do. We spend a lot more time on things like depressions than he does, and a lot less time on talking about the wonderful ways in which markets work. But we do some of that, and he does some of our stuff. So it's all the same. So, and that's the answer. And you really should, if you're going to choose one, choose mine, because Mankiw has the second best-selling textbook, and we have the third, and we're trying to remedy that market failure. Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'm going to take one more question. Sorry, that was the last question, I think.
One of the phenomena that we've seen recently with online games and virtual worlds is the fact that people are prepared to pay, real money for things that don't exist. People are prepared to pay real money for magic swords that only have some meaning inside a game world. People are prepared to pay real money for real estate that doesn't exist. I know they used to do that in Florida, but this stuff really I think it's sort of like $100 million a year or something. It's it's not an insignificant thing. Of course, when you think about it, real money is just bits inside a computer. So what you're doing is you're flipping some bits in a bank computer and you're flipping some bits inside a game service computer. Do you think that we're going to see any sort of economic significance out of this? Might we see the rise of alternative mediums of exchange and that kind of thing, or is it just a flash in the pan?
Yeah, I don't see why not. But the real economy is a lot more virtual than we like to think. Right? Some people have trouble with that. Some people still think, money can't be money unless it's actual gold. And yet, actually, even gold is a moderately useful metal, but only really has the value it has because it has this essentially symbolic significance. So I don't think it actually makes that much difference that we're doing this. Now, there is an interesting question: if virtual worlds get big enough, will they? And the virtual currency that's being used in those worlds gets big enough. At what point or under what circumstances does it actually draw the attention of the authorities? Because we haven't had. It's probably no different than in this case than. Well, actually, no. People might start to say, banks at which orcs and trolls move sums around should actually be subject to capital requirements and reserve requirements, right? Because they might actually trigger problems out here in non-cyberspace. These things. The point is actually anything that starts to function as money. Starts to take on some of the policy significance of money. I'm going to give you one last story. I'm going to leave, but my favorite hyperinflation was Israel had a hyperinflation in '84-'5, which I haven't been there for part of it. And what was kind of nice about it was normally a hyperinflation is associated with all kinds of other terrible things happening. There were a war, civil war, revolution. And in this case, they just managed to have an incredible muck-up in their monetary policy, but life went on pretty much normally. So it was prices were rising at crazy rates. Some supermarkets started instituting. They would sell you coupons at the beginning of the month that would let you lock in the prices of stuff at the supermarket for the rest of the month. And eventually, the Bank of Israel moved in and banned them because they were in effect printing currency. And they're not allowed to do that. That's reserved for the officials. So there probably will be a point at which, if the stuff gets big enough, it'll be subject to regulation. And so it goes. The point being, and maybe this is the way to finish. This economic world we've created is already a world that's very, very far removed from simply I've got this, you've got that, let's make a deal. It's a complex system which is very much exists in the form of symbols and created a sort of created reality that ultimately is linked to physical stuff. But and so sure, there's actually no real reason to think that real estate in a magical world is particularly more peculiar as something that people would pay real money for than the second tranche of a credit of a collateralized debt obligation backed by subprime mortgages, right? That's where we are in this world. Okay, thanks everybody.